This is the FYI on Youth Ministry, a youth ministry podcast from the Fuller Youth Institute. This season, we are focusing on the 5 ways we can cultivate a faith that goes beyond youth group with our students. But first, let's hear what youth leaders had to say about today's topic.
When I think about faith beyond youth group, I think about what's always been the goal, that students' faith actually lives outside of the context of what we're doing in youth group when they're at their soccer game or when they're away at college.
Faith beyond youth group to me means that my students are intentionally thinking about what we did or what we're talking about or what we're thinking about at youth group, not on Wednesday night, that they are given practical resources or that they have a thought that continues on beyond when their youth leader is prompting them or when their youth pastor is in front of them. The obstacles that I face with my students when it comes to them living their faith beyond youth group is how busy their schedules are. I'm always overwhelmed by their own calendars and what they choose to fit in and how they prioritize. And so for them at their age, it's hard for them to figure out how those pieces all fit together.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to a new season of the FYI on Youth Ministry. This is Roslyn Hernandez. I am the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Manager and Content Producer at the Fuller Youth Institute. And this season, we're talking about discipleship that cultivates a faith in our students that goes beyond youth group. And in this episode, we have the co-authors of Faith Beyond Youth Group, which is our latest book here at FYI. We have Kara Powell, who is our Executive Director here at the Fuller Youth Institute, and she's also the Chief of Leadership Formation at Fuller Seminary. We have Jen Bradbury, who is our Content Director, and Brad Griffin, who's our Senior Director of Content and Research. Hello, everyone. Welcome.
It's great to be together. I kind of feel like we're having a staff meeting here and we're just going to talk publicly in front of people. So love this.
And we get to talk about something that you enjoy so much, which is youth ministry, and what has kept you going for so long, or what has kept you connected to youth ministry for so many years.
So I love youth ministry because of getting to see the way that young people's minds think. So particularly, I love the middle school age group. And I love the randomness of that age group, but I love the seriousness of that age group too.
That's so good, Jen. It reminds me, I was thinking that I love that young people keep us honest about how weird scripture is, how strange faith is, how odd it is to follow Jesus. It keeps me thinking in fresh ways about my own faith too.
I'll focus on something different about what I love about young people than what Brad and Jen have said, and that is how young people see potential. They're so aware of the pain in our world. They're so aware of brokenness. They see it on their phones. They see it in their lives. And yet they have a what if we, or how about if we tried approach. Their belief that while the world is broken, they can make a difference, that I find especially inspiring these days.
And so, Jen, can you tell us a little bit about the research that led to our latest book, Faith Beyond Youth Group?
Yeah, happy to, Roz. We surveyed youth ministry leaders from across the country, so a national survey. Then we interviewed a smaller pool of them. And then we actually went and we visited churches in person. So we saw discipleship that is often slow and patient and resilient, even in the face of everything that's going on in our changing world. And so we began to talk about this kind of discipleship as faith beyond youth group, which we unpack as this idea of being Jesus-centered character that matters every day.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Jen. Was there something that was surprising, I wonder, Kara, that you're continuing to mull over, to learn about, that came from the research or from what you learned from Faith Beyond Youth Group?
I think what's probably been the most surprising is how parents, grandparents, caregivers have been responding to Faith Beyond Youth Group. As parents have been encountering it, as they've been hearing about it, and again, grandparents, guardians, step parents, family members in general. What's been surprising to me is how they say, wow, this is relevant to how I want to build faith at home too. And I think they're actually right that the 5 points of the compass, that is really the heart of the book, are certainly key in youth ministry, but they're also just key for any adult who wants to have a meaningful faith forming relationship with a young person. So I'd say the biggest surprise is the transferability of what we learned beyond youth group contexts into family contexts too.
Who was someone that when you were young was someone that was showing you how to live your faith beyond youth group?
My list on this could be really long, Roz, but the people I'll talk about today was a married couple, John and Jen. And they were one of the few like young adults in my congregation at the time. So they were in their early 20s. And what stands out to me about John in terms of modeling faith is he was an electrical engineer at ComEd, which was the big power company in our city. And he would often talk about how his faith intersected with his work. And so there was this tangible example of this man who was not paid by the church, who I saw living out his faith on a day-to-day basis, living out his faith on a way that went far beyond the walls of the church. And that, for me as a kid, was so striking and so memorable.
So I'll share who came to mind first, Rosalind, when you asked that question, and that is my mom. I was raised, especially in early childhood, by my mom as a single parent. And my most vivid memories of my mom's faith are that every morning she would ask us to give her time alone. It was because she would sit on our living room couch in her robe and have a cup of coffee in one hand and a Bible in the other. And that was her time with the Lord. And that just really grounded me as a kid to know that my mom was praying for me and my brother and our world every day. And that her faith wasn't just a I go to church faith, but it was a 7-day-a-week faith, which is really the heart of Faith Beyond Youth Group.
You know, who came to mind for me was somebody who, when I was in high school, was a volunteer in our church. We had a very small youth group, and this volunteer, her name was Gayleen. She was a single mom and was a youth group volunteer, and she was a parent of 2 students, and she just showed up faithfully, and she was so fun to be around, and she had a lot going on in her life, and yet was really clear about Jesus, her faith in Jesus being what really carried her through and gave her energy and joy. And she was a joyful and present person. And I think that made her a really safe person to be around, knowing that she had walked through and was walking through sometimes pretty hard things. And also that there was something about trusting God in the midst of that that was an anchor for her. And that really shaped my faith and my perception of just what it looks like to follow Jesus in real life.
Thanks for sharing your examples. I know that there's examples in the book, and I hope that as listeners are reading and learning, they can also have these memories of the people that have been there in their lives, that have inspired their faith, and that have taught them how to live it everywhere they are and at any time. Brad, we tend to say here at FYI that we like to answer the tough questions that leaders are asking. So what questions does Faith Beyond Youth Group answer, and why is it important for youth leaders today?
As a youth leader, I think at the core, we often are haunted by questions like, does what we're doing really matter? Are we making a difference? We hear a lot from youth leaders about, well, we don't get a lot of time with students these days. How can we really disciple them well? What does that look like? And so I really think under all of these questions really is a question about impact. I hope this book can really help youth leaders wrestle with that question and look at research that will help them spend their time and their energy and focus in ways that really do make a difference.
That's great. I think that's something that all youth leaders want, right? We want to make a difference in young people's lives.
Do you want to be better equipped to engage young people in your community? We offer 2-day workshops in cities around the country to help you and your team focus on what's most essential in discipling young people. You could stop guessing and grasping at trends and increase the impact of your ministry through research-based strategies. Let's hear from Zach, one of our recent attendees.
I really appreciated the question and answer times where we took concepts and made them more practical. I would say it was definitely worth the investment, the 400 miles to get to the workshop. Also, just the fact of all of the resources that then are offered from the workshop that we get to use now. This has been revitalizing, and it definitely is an opportunity that I'm looking forward to taking our team through to grow closer together to each other, that we can serve everybody in our church, and that we can all look a little bit more like Jesus as we do that.
Look for a workshop near you at fulleryouthinstitute.org/workshop.
We've kind of talked a little bit around and mentioned the compass. So why don't we go ahead and can you all walk us through the compass points and give us some examples of each?
Yeah, we'd be happy to, Rosalind. The first point of the compass is cultivating or building trust. And if we're honest, this is a generation that is slow to trust adults, slow to trust institutions. They're much more likely to trust social media influencers than they are institutions. And that includes the church. And I'm sad to say that that's often for good reason. They look at the church and they see hypocrisy, they see moral failure. And so we have our work cut out for us when it comes to this first point of building trust. The good news is that trust is not built from grand gestures. It's built in everyday acts of showing that we care and showing that we are who we say we are. So it's listening to a young person. It's asking how to pray for them and then following up and asking, how did that test go? Or how did that conversation go? It's showing up when and where we've said we will be. So it's a big task, but it's something that we can build in bite-sized steps that we can take every day. But it starts with building trust.
Yeah, and the next point on the compass builds off of that. So it's the idea of modeling growth. It's the idea that we want adults to be able to be authentically imperfect, because the reality is that young people, they have all tasted failure in a way that not all of them have tasted success. And so when we are able as adults to say, here are the ways that I'm growing, here are the ways that I screwed up today, here are the questions that I'm asking about my own faith, that signals to young people that they can show up as their authentically imperfect selves and still be welcomed and still find belonging in our spaces. And that feeds into the next point on the compass, which is this idea of teach for transformation. So we readily believe that part of character formation, part of lifelong discipleship is this aspect of teaching. But we also think that character is caught as much as taught. And so this idea of teaching for transformation says that teaching is not just about standing up and delivering the perfect talk that you have worked hard on all week. It's more than that. It's about engaging young people where they're actually at. It's about taking what you want to be able to teach them and posing it as a question so that they can actually figure out the answer for themselves. Because when they do that, that's part of how young people come to own their own discipleship, their own faith. Jesus taught transformatively, and the ways that he taught transformatively was by asking questions, not necessarily being the answer person, by sharing his authority.
So I'll move on to the fourth point of our 5-point compass, and that is practice together. It's to build that muscle memory of what it looks like to have faith beyond youth group. And so sometimes that's actually going out into the streets and practicing together. Other times that's practicing in the midst of your church community. How can you live this out? Sometimes it's just having a better, more tangible discussion within the confines of youth group that's not abstract, but it's about real life problems, real life situations where we desperately want God's love and grace and hope to intervene. And what does that actually look like today? And Brad has been quiet up till now on the compass. So he's going to back clean up, so to speak, and talk about the fifth point of the compass. Correct any heresies, add details, do whatever you want to do, Brad.
And quick shout out to Yuli Lee, who was part of that team who pushed us to give Practice Together its own space. Yeah. And we're really grateful she contributed as a guest author on that chapter too, and really helped flesh that out. And so I get to go last because the last point on the compass is make meaning. And this is one of my personal obsessions, I would say.
Yeah, I can vouch for that. I can totally vouch for that. He is obsessed with it.
So, some of it is being an Enneagram 1, which Jen is too. We could that might divert us a little bit, but just this sense of like not just what we do matters, but why we do it. Why and how we do it, and what's underneath that. And so, making meaning with young people is helping them process all they experience as well as all that's going on in the world and make spiritual sense of it. Meaning makers, they shape our lives in so many ways, and they help us take what is and help us not just like deal with it, but also understand and integrate it into our lives. And so I think when we're at our best in ministry, we're helping young people do that kind of integrative work. There are times I think we skimp on this in youth ministry. And, some of us maybe need to turn our compass a little more towards making meaning to help young people get to the so what and the what now that comes out of everything that happens in their lives and in the world.
Yeah, I think, like thinking back on my own experience of being in youth ministry or even teaching or leading in youth ministry, it seems like the first 3 points, right? Like cultivating trust and modeling growth and teaching, those 3 seem to be some of the 3 biggest ones that we think about whenever we think about discipleship to young people. But it does feel like if we just focus on those 3, that's what keeps youth ministry in. Or that's what keeps the faith in the church, or what keeps the faith in the youth ministry, and practicing together and going out there in the world, or like making meaning of what's happening in the world, really brings the faith, the discipleship out of youth group and into the world and into integration. I hope that our listeners can start getting inspired about how they want to think about each of these compass points and want to learn more about it. So we're going to move on to a fun little time, which is a lightning round. You get a 1-word or a 1-sentence answer. I know you all are researchers and theologians, so it's hard for you to say
We're
one
wordy.
word or 1 sentence. That's what's going to make this fun. Okay, so we're going to, these questions kind of go along with the compass. When you were a teen, what was one thing that helped you trust others?
Making me feel like I belong.
For me, it was asking good questions.
For me, it was wanting to spend time with me.
Spending time's so good. Okay. What is something you learned from someone that modeled it for you as a young person?
I learned how failure is not the end of a story.
Who wants to follow that?
Yeah, I was going to say something similar, but not as pithy. So I'll go with that. Failure is not the end of the story. I agree.
I learned hard work from my mom, and that you sometimes you just have to keep showing up and doing hard work.
So thinking back on a youth ministry fail, and it can be your own or it can be one that you saw, finish this sentence. I do not recommend
putting a middle schooler in the trunk of your car and then driving a mile with them. That's sadly not a hypothetical, and that boy's mom was not too happy, understandably. One of the dumbest things I've done as a youth leader.
I do not recommend going behind your pastor's back when they've told you that you can't do something publicly, like, I don't know, a commissioning service for a mission trip, and doing it anyway publicly. I don't recommend that.
And I don't recommend making parents the enemies. So setting it up in a conversation where you're suddenly pitting young people against their parents or guardians, it's a bad idea.
Yes, yes. Ooh, those are good. Okay. So tell us one spiritual practice that you loved when you were young, and maybe one that was more of a challenge.
I've always loved prayer when I was young. And I'm an Enneagram 3, so rest is a challenge. So Sabbath is only something I've really come to embrace later in life.
This maybe is not what you think of when you think of a practice, but it is the first thing that I thought of for this question. So one of the people who modeled spiritual practices for me was a musician. And she had this understanding that worship was not just worship songs or songs from the hymnal, depending on your tradition, but that it was anything that you were playing essentially for the glory of God. And so that, as a pianist, that was a spiritual practice that was really life-giving for me. One that was challenging for me was actually prayer. I was in a setting where it was all like rote prayers, which have their place, and I now love as an adult, but I didn't as a kid.
So for me, this may not be surprising because I love words, but I really loved reading the Bible when I was a teenager, and found it fascinating. So that was not a challenge for me, but what actually came to mind, fasting was a real challenge. And I mean, still is, but we would do, it was like the popularity of programs like 30-hour fasting and whatever. And that was just the worst for me. So I did not connect with that practice.
Did you try to sneak in a snack or something?
Oh no, I was too much of a rule follower. So I just had a really bad headache and felt like falling over. Yes.
As I was asking that, I was like, no, Brad would never do that.
No, Rosalind. Nope.
What is one thing that you needed help to make meaning of when you were a teenager?
When I was a 14-year-old freshman, my grandma died, and 2 weeks later, my uncle died. So I needed help making meaning of death.
I think I needed more help making meaning of walking out a faith journey in a family that was not really connected with faith. And I think the messages that I got about that from the evangelical community were, looking back, were maybe more harmful than helpful at that time.
I ran for student body president in 11th grade and lost in my high school. And it was totally embarrassing and this big public failure. And I needed help making meaning of that. And actually, God worked through my youth pastor and his wife in that season. And they really did journey with me and help me make meaning, for which I'm grateful.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing. To finish this episode, we want to share a little bit of what our hopes are for our listeners, for people who get the book or who want to learn more about Faith Beyond Youth Group. So how do you hope Faith Beyond Youth Group helps leaders and young people?
What first comes to mind for me is I really hope every youth leader, when they're thinking about their youth group every week, that one of the first questions on their mind is what's going to happen after youth group? What's going to happen outside of youth group? That what we do together will matter outside of youth group.
For me, one of the things that has been really encouraging as we have been speaking about Faith Beyond Youth Group is the way the Compass actually encourages youth leaders. So people from all different denominations, sizes of ministries, budgets, are able to see themselves in the Compass. And while they're able to identify, oh, here's an area that I need work on, almost everybody that we've encountered is also able to say, hey, I'm really good at doing this part of the Compass. And in this moment where youth leaders are just feeling so beat up, one of my hopes is that they will feel like youth ministry is possible, like they're doing it well, like God is using them in some really incredible ways.
Yeah.
Those are great answers. So my hope actually goes back to what we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, that all three of us said we were in youth ministry and love youth ministry because of young people. And my biggest hope for our country and our world is young people. And my biggest hope for young people is that they would know the abundant life that comes from following Jesus, that Jesus describes in John 10:10. And so my hope is that young people learn that faith is not something they do 75 minutes a week on the weeks when they happen to make it to church or small group, but that the journey with Jesus is something that they get to do 7 days a week for their entire lives. So my biggest hope is that young people would be passionate about Jesus, and that would change them as well as change our world.
That's great. Thank you so much. As much as they're filled with hope, they're also very encouraging, very inspiring as well. So I'm so glad that you got to come today and share about this so that everyone can learn a little bit more about Faith Beyond Youth Group and what it's all about. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks,
Thanks
Rosalind.
for having us.
Yeah.
This podcast is one of the many free resources produced by the Fuller Youth Institute. Check out the show notes for links to all the resources mentioned in today's episode. Thanks so much for listening. And finally, here's one more thought from a youth leader.
I think one of the difficulties of helping students live faith beyond youth group is the immediate gratification culture we live in, immediate satisfaction, and many times the journey of faith is not always answered in a prayer right now and a result right away. That faith is growing something deeper in us, more resolved in us, and helping students have the patience and endurance and resolve to follow Jesus, and to trust God when things are still messy and don't make sense, that he will make sense of that there is a journey to that. And so helping them see beyond that when everything else in their life is immediate. If you're not getting playing time, change schools, go to a different school. If this isn't working, change your classes. Everything is instant change. So help them have trust and faith and patience in God.